Okay. I was hired as a vacation relief, sick relief, on-air television reporter, which meant that I was promised first dibs at any vacancies that came up. And people would go on vacation and they needed to find people to sort of fill in. So that was my entry in. And the distinction of it is that you had no job security. You were basically working freelance, and if you weren't working, then you were waiting by your phone, waiting for a call to go to work. But at that time in 1970, there were no Asian Americans on air in the San Francisco Bay Area doing news reporting. In 1970, there were actually no Asian Americans who were reporters for the San Francisco Chronicle or the San Francisco Examiner or the Oakland Tribune or the San Jose Mercury News, which at the time were the four big metropolitan daily newspapers of the Bay Area. So my hire was a real breakthrough because before then there were no Asian Americans who were hired. In fact, we weren't even considered, we were not considered as people who could be hired. I do remember going to a broadcast jobs fair and meeting the news director of KCBS News Radio. And he asked me, young man, what do you want to be? What do you want to do? I said, I want to be an announcer. He laughed. Now, you could say, well, okay, he laughed because he said, aha. That's what everybody who's interested in broadcasting wants to do. But he didn't give me any words of encouragement. He just laughed. And because he didn't give any words of encouragement, and I didn't really see that he was, laughing at, the wonder of a young man wanting to break into this field, I took it as he really thought it was laughable that a Chinese person, could be an announcer. I wondered if he even thought that I could speak English. So that was part of the atmosphere of racism that I grew up with at that time in 1970. I'm a Chinatown kid. I was raised in Chinatown. I'm born in San Francisco. I grew up on Stockton Street in front of the 30 Stockton bus stop. At that time, Stockton Street was maybe 1/3 as busy as it is today, because when I was a child, I could ride my bicycle on the sidewalk down Stockton Street. So, times were different back then. But even then, it was very rare to hear of an Asian American who was working downtown or any place outside of our ethnic enclaves. So in my case, Chinatown, and other people's cases would be Japantown and whatnot. And my parents always told me that, you really have to work hard and do better than your competition if they're going to be considered. But when I told them that I wanted to go into journalism, they said, you're crazy. No one will hire you. Well, 1970 is sort of like, the civil rights movement and really started in the 50s. And Chinese and other Asian Americans didn't start pushing for representation in the rest of society, didn't start pushing for employment in the professional fields and in any areas outside of the ethnic enclaves until the 60s. So this is the time where affirmative action came to the fore. And after the race riots of the 60s, of Watts, Chicago, Detroit, Newark, New Jersey, the country became aware that there was a lot of unrest because of racial discrimination in employment, housing, and whatnot. And so there was a big push for affirmative action to have representation of ethnic minorities in all facets of society. And the Kerner Commission report, which was commissioned by the President of the United States, demonstrated that one of the key areas of non-representation of ethnic minorities in the country was in the media, was in the newspapers, radio, television, and movies, and advertising. And that report also found that because of the lack of representation, the lives of ethnic minorities was not well known. The aspirations of ethnic minorities was not understood. The true history of ethnic minorities was suppressed. I mean, that's, we have to remember that ethnic studies started here at San Francisco State College during the Third World Strike. That was in 1968, which is the same year as the Kerner Commission report. And the same forces that created ethnic studies here at San Francisco State were the same forces, socioeconomic, social justice, were the same forces creating affirmative action throughout our society. And it was also impacting the media because the commission said the media is lily white. Not just lily white, but also had virtually no women representation in positions of decision-making or reporting. So a vast area of society is voiceless, was not being represented. So I do remember growing up in the Bay Area and seeing that the portrayal of my own people was very limited to New Year's, to Fu Manchu, Charlie Chan, and other negative stereotypes. And there was really no role models for us to move up in the world. We made great strides because people became conscious and aware, and they became conscious and aware through the media, the news media. And that's why the Bay Area Archives is so important, because it's a window to history. It's a window to the world as it was back then. And from what you see through this window, you will know where you came from and the reasons why the society that you see today has evolved into this. We've come a long way, but a lot of the same issues, a lot of the same problems, a lot of the same aspirations 50, 70 years ago are even more compelling today. And by knowing what people were doing back then and knowing what people were saying back then will definitely inform you going forward, and will also may inspire you as to how you can make change for the better and what mistakes to avoid. The archives are very important because it gives you, today people are visual learners. People don't read. Back in my time, you would go to the library and you would find a lot of knowledge in the library. Today, people go to the library to study, but they don't really go to the library to explore and to find out new things. But now, we live in a totally different world where you have instant communication and you have instant audio-visual. Back then, it was a labor to create television reports, to create stories that incorporated sound and picture. Back then, when I started, we worked in 16mm film. So you would go out and shoot a story in the morning, come back in the afternoon, put the film into a laboratory, wait a couple of hours for the film to be developed and to come out, that you can start to edit, and then hopefully you would get it on the 6 o'clock news. Today, you can film a story on your phone, and then you can broadcast it on your phone to the World Wide Web. That was, I think, to a lot of people, unthinkable back in the time that I started, 55 years ago? So that's why the Bay Area Archives is very important, because outside of the newspapers, there's no record of what people were doing and what changes were going on. I mean, the Archives has a record of the Summer of Love, 1967, the birth of the San Francisco Sound and rock music, all kinds, I mean, incredible amounts of history that, maybe, you study now in the textbooks and whatnot, is actually in the archives, because it's history reported in that instant. And you can also see where some of the reporting was wrong, because you have 50 years of hindsight to back on. But the value of the archives is incalculable. I mean, it's up there with, people say, oh, the Bancroft Library, the Library of Congress. It preserves our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence and glass things. Archives is the San Francisco equivalent, audiovisual-wise. When you're trying to break into a field like broadcast journalism, you are mindful of sort of the I don't know how do you express it, but there's an ethos. In journalism school they teach you about objectivity, being objective, or if not objective, then being fair. There's always two sides to a story, at least. And so you're conscious of not showing bias, not taking one side or the other. And you're conscious that management is going to be watching you for that. But at the same time, you also know that you want to give voice to the people who you are covering, to people who heretofore didn't have a voice. So, and then if you're an ethnic minority, or if you were a woman, who was considered a minority at that time, you would also be bearing the burden of not pushing your ethnicity or your gender as a cause. So you had to be mindful of walking down a line where you could appear to be impartial, objective, even-handed. And sometimes that would neuter the impact of your stories. But at the same time, you knew that what you brought to the table was knowledge and a perspective that people who were not of your background would have. I happen to be very lucky in not only getting into a dream job at the age of 21, and getting a job at the #1 TV station in the area, and at the commercial station where reporting was respected. I was lucky to be in that position. And management, when they hired me, when they looked at me, they were under pressure to hire a Chinese or an Asian for, diversity, equity, and inclusion principles. We didn't have those letters back then, but that's basically the same thing. And they were looking to hire someone, and I had, other people who applied for my job was Connie Chung, who everybody knows, and others who were also of my persuasion. But the reason why they gave me a shot was they were looking for someone who was from the area and who had some knowledge of the community. So I was with an employer who was broad-minded enough to think in those terms. So when I came onto the scene, I did feel that I could look for stories that were about my community. But at the same time, I had a heavy burden to prove that I could do a story as well as anyone, and I could do any story as well as anyone. And that meant that you sometimes us ethnic reporters would have the burden of not wanting to be pigeonholed or, ghettoized as the black reporter, the Chicano reporter, the Native American reporter, the reporter who only covers women's issues. So we were conscious of not falling into that trap. So some of us, would consciously look for white stories or stories that were, of general impact. But in the case of Under Their Ancestors' Shadows, which was a half-hour documentary about Chinatown's youth gangs who were emerging as a problem because they were being used as soldiers in the criminal underworld around. And they came to the fore because bodies started to wash up on the shores of Redwood City that were trussed up. And these appeared to be like gangland-style murders. And then there were merchants in Chinatown who were complaining of being extorted by youth gangs who were offering themselves as protection. Like if you don't pay me, then I'll bust your windows, or I'll sit in the corner of your restaurant in my gangland style outfit and intimidate everybody, which basically turns away business. So that was sort of like a racket. But there were socioeconomic reasons for why these things were going on. So I explored that in the half hour. And the station actually asked me, because they read in the newspapers of all these things going on, and they said, do you think you could do something about this? And I said, well, let me think about it, because this is my community and you're talking about gangs, I'm at risk. But I said, let me think about it, let me find out what I can find out. And so I did some research, and I found out that a lot of these gang members were contemporaries of mine. I went to high school with them, some of them. And then I talked to other people who were involved in social services and who were involved at City College, and who said, hey, these kids are troubled kids. And some of them are involved in gangs for protection, self-protection, and because there's no jobs. Well, what else can they do? And, we live in a dog-eat-dog world, so, you got to do what you got to do to stay alive. So I went back to my employers and I said, I can do this, but I'm going to need time to develop sources and shoot these scenes and interviews. So I was able to get the gang members to talk on camera. I got, interviews with the police. I got interviews with social workers, and then I, got the whole socioeconomic profile of the community. And I won an Associated Press Award for investigative reporting as a result of that. So as an ethnic reporter, I said, I did a service to my community. But I was also recognized journalistically for excellence. So that's sort of like the tightrope that you're walking down as an ethnic reporter. And some people looked at me as I said, where did you come from? Did you work at some smaller station and work your way up? You just bang, hit the big time, right out of college. Well, I had prepared myself in college from high school, in journalism. I had done radio at UC Berkeley. So when I was a student at Berkeley, I was covering People's Park, the peace protests of Vietnam. I was tear gassed by helicopters, all that kind of stuff. But I also, did reporting on the student stations, and I measured myself up against what I saw on television. I would go out, do my stories, then I'd go home and then I'd watch what the coverage was on the media, and I would measure myself. I said, I could do that if I knew what the process was. I didn't know what the process was, and I had to go to school to learn what the process was. But I already had the chops, as they say, to do journalism. In today's society, a lot of media that we see is of a documentary form. It's like a portrayal of reality. And the archives are important because they're a source of the history in the past. So in the films like Free Josue Lee, a lot of the footage of the past, of that era, are from the archives. There's a film called Chinatown Rising, which is a film by Harry Chuck, who is a film student. He's a film graduate of SF State. And when he could not finish his thesis project, his film project, which was on Chinatown, because he was busy advocating for affordable housing and housing for seniors in Chinatown. And so he couldn't make a film and lead a social justice movement at the same time. But 50 years later, with his son, he was able to take that footage that he shot here at SF State, combine it with the footage that he was able to get from the archives, which portrayed conditions of society back then, into a film called Chinatown Rising, which is, a great educational document. It's been on PBS, that portrays a history of Asian America from the 60s to the present, that, even there are few textbooks around that subject area. So the archives, you could do the same thing with the Black Panther movement. When I was at Channel 5, I covered Huey Newton. I covered his second trial for murder. I covered the fatal prison escape attempt by George Jackson at San Quentin Prison. I covered the new mobilization. There were these mass protests against the Vietnam War. People would march from the Ferry Building, down Market Street, out Geary to the polo fields. And this was like a mass mobilization of like 200,000 people. I covered that. I had a little bit where we had some live coverage on the CBS network where we cut into the daytime programming to do that. So those were great movements that raised people's consciousness and really contributed towards America changing its stance on the war. So those things are in the Bay Area TV archives. I'm not only the first Asian hired, but I was also the first Asian fired from on-air television work in 1973. And I was basically a victim of a purge because the station went from number 1 to number 2, and station management freaked out and hired all kinds of consultants to tinker with the format and the presentation to a point where we said, I thought we were journalists. I thought we were doing journalism. And we were told, no, you're in show business. So I was a victim of that in one sense. And then for several years, I could not find another full-time job in journalism. I was blackballed as someone who was intractable. So I left journalism for a while, went back to my community, and I started to do oral history interviews using my media skills for the benefit of my community. In the process, I discovered that Angel Island contained an immigration station that had been operating from 1910 to 1940, and this was the main immigration point for people coming from the Pacific. I found out that the state, and this immigration station is now a National Historic Landmark that you can visit, because on its walls are poetry and graffiti that was carved by the inmates who were expressing their grief at being held in detention because of the immigration laws. After I left Channel 5, I started a group to save that immigration station from demolition by the state. So that's one of my other distinctions. I also became active in Asian American cultural affairs. I organized the first National Asian American Writers Conference at the Oakland Museum and the San Francisco Chinese Culture Center. What other distinctions have I done? I'm blanking out, but I've also, I'm the co-producer, co-director, co-writer for the film Fall of the Eye Hotel, which was about the eviction of the elderly Asian tenants at the International Hotel on Kearny Street, which is the last remnant of Manila Town. I have since gone into youth work. So I was also director of the Beacon Center for the Richmond district in San Francisco. And today the beacons, there are like 8 beacon centers throughout the city that provides after school enrichment programs, academic support for middle school and high school students. So I ran a youth program before. I'm currently working on a couple of books, one about the history of Asian American journalism pioneers, and also I'm a co-founder of the Asian Pacific Democratic Caucus in the National Committee. So I was involved in the emergence of Asian Americans in politics here. Now, I'm not a politician, but I helped to push the representation of Asian Americans in the system. And I've done all of these things from the perspective of one who wanted to do something for my community and to use my media skills in that regard. And so I think that, my message to young people today would be, in the words of Jesse Jackson, keep hope alive. And I would add to that, keep hope alive with truth, justice, and good journalism. Let the people know. What young people have today is incredibly great access to the tools of production, to the tools of journalism or the tools of media. I mean, being able to record events on your phone and being able to broadcast it, via the internet or, via TikTok or via messaging or whatnot, Zoom, today, Zoom is a great substitute for television interviews because, you don't have to go to someone's house or someone's office to conduct an interview. You can Zoom it. So today, people have greater tools and greater accessibility. The difference is the audience has changed. You've heard about the fragmentation of television itself. Streaming and the web have taken huge slices of audience, of market share, away from traditional media, which is television, radio, and newspapers. And newspapers today now have their own video sections. If you go online and you go to the website of Los Angeles Times, instead of seeing the headlines of today's top stories, you see what is streaming now on the LA Times website. So the LA Times is, they have their own video units, their own people who are, recording video, editing video, and posting it. Those are people who are competing with your traditional journalists. So today's environment has changed. The need for journalism and the need for people to go into journalism is higher than ever before because of the proliferation of misinformation, disinformation. People talk about fake news, but how do you combat fake news? It seems like in today's times you combat fake news by having a louder voice, having a bigger trumpet than the other guy. If you talk to people in politics, they'll say the reason, why the Democrats are doing so poorly is because the Republicans have out-media them. They've got quicker, rapid response, catchier slogans. They're able to paint the opposition in a negative picture in a easily memorable way. So it's sort of like, okay, whoever shouts the loudest gets the most benefit, is the winner. So that's sort of the environment that they're in. But the need for people to compete is as great as ever. If you're asking me today, would I encourage anyone to go into journalism? I would say no. Not if you are looking to make a living. Not if you choosing this as a lifelong career path, because there are no permanent jobs in journalism. And in today's environment, there are the journalism jobs that have, that's full-time, pays benefits, those are reserved for a very few. So if you're a young student and you come to me asking me for advice, I would say no. Don't go into journalism as a career path. Fall into it. Get your foundation in some skills first. And you can develop. You can go and if you really want to pursue journalism, do it after your undergraduate years. But you need a firm foundation in a subject matter. It could be political science. It could be language. Spanish, Chinese. English, of course. Those are the 3 #1 languages in the fucking world. So if you have those languages, then you can function, and then, and these skills will, and then also to develop some business skills. You have to learn how to market yourself in today's climate. So you need all of these things besides the journalism. And, there's a lot of people who are in journalism who fall into it. It came upon them because they were doing something else and somebody came to them and said, you are an expert. I want your expertise. And you can express and explain your expertise in a way that people understand. So that makes you media-wise. So that's the way I would encourage people to pursue journalism. But also you could look at journalism as, people go into media for art. They want to express themselves. They want to create a story. Well, that's great. But right now, making money from it, being able to support a family, it's for the few. You really got to be lucky and fortunate. So if you're starting out, you just really got to hone in on developing your skills and keeping your goal in mind and saying, I'm going to get there by different paths, but I'm going to arm myself with the basic skills. So times have gotten better, but we're still dealing with some terrible things. But if you master the skills, and you keep hope alive in your heart, you could make change. And that's what I would like to see. I'd like to see you young people do that. Pursue your dreams. Get ahead. Make use of the archives. You really should. Just the visuals alone can be mind-blowing. I know, Alex, you have a hard job with the archives because basically you have pieces of the news reports. You have a few that you're able to reconstruct. But because back then when you had film, I don't know if any of you have ever taken a film class, but to do a report for television, you would have to have one reel, one projector for the pictures, for the visual. You had another projector for the soundtrack, and then you had another projector for the B-roll, for the cutaways. And so when you got into the studio, the director would be going Proj 1, Proj 2, Proj 3, and then the technical director would be pressing the button to put up whatever the picture or the sound that needed to go with it. And that was what was broadcast. And if they videotaped that broadcast, that's how you would have a record of the complete story. But because the stupid stations erased those videotapes, recycled them after 1 week, a lot of those wonderful reports in their integrity are lost, because all we have now are the reels. And so the difficulty for you, Alex, is how do you piece these pieces together without a script? And do you have all of the, They're also a script that has the instructions of, like, when you go to projector 1, when you go to projector 2, when you go to projector 3, that you have to guess. You've done quite a job from what I've seen so far, but there's so much more that you have in your library. So I think the university's got to give you more support.
Good.